After this video, you won't ever see this bottle in the same way again. I recently fell into a Bragg family rabbit hole, and now every time I see this brand on anything at the grocery, I cannot help but think about one of the greatest con men in American history. Our story starts in 1881 on a family farm 32 miles outside of a small Virginia town. Paul Bragg was born, and he would end up being the eldest of 16 children. When each one of the children came of age, they worked on the farm, but none of them worked as hard as the Bragg father. He was out of the door before first light and often wouldn't return until after sunset. Young Paulie loved farm life, but he desperately wanted to grow up to be a soldier. He requested many times to go to military school, but his requests were continually denied. But all of this would change when one day after school, a 12-year-old Paul was walking home when he heard a man yelling for help. Help! 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 Without a second thought, he ran in the direction of the cries, where he quickly found himself standing on the bank of a mighty river. Miraculously, he saved the man's life. Paul's parents were so impressed with his bravery that they gifted him with an enrollment to the nearest military academy. It was at the academy that he discovered his gift for wrestling. Paul was starting to develop into quite a strong young man. Things were going quite well until he suddenly became very ill. Paul was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Worried about his health, his parents sent him away to a world-renowned facility in Switzerland. Paul would spend the next 2 years with Dr. Augustus Rollier, a pioneer in the art of heliotherapy, also known as light therapy. Paul showed an interest in the healing arts and learned a great deal from the doctor, and after a long battle, the boy was eventually cured. He would then return to the United States, where he vowed to commit his life to healing people. His wellness crusade started with his sister, who was gravely ill when he returned to the farm. Paul refused to leave her side, feeding her whole foods, nourishing her with good, clean water, and a long-time family remedy: apple cider vinegar. Growing up on the farm, Paul noticed that his father would add the tart liquid to feed for sick animals, and he would also mix the liquid into honey and some water for himself after a long day of work. Coincidentally, apple cider vinegar was also readily available at Dr. Rollier's institute. After healing his sister, Paul resumed wrestling and trained for the Olympics, eventually participating in the 1908 and 1912 games. After returning from Stockholm after the 1912 games, Paul opened America's first health food store in Los Angeles, and it was established in 1912. That's why the date is right here on the bottle. A few years after the store's grand opening, Paul would enlist in the army. He was sent overseas and came back a war hero after participating in almost all of the major battles. He would continue his life's work by giving lectures, developing healthcare products, and building communities of people interested in living a clean and healthy lifestyle. All of this would be great if any of it were true, but unfortunately, almost all of it's a lie. And we're going to spend the rest of the video unpacking all of the lies that Paul Bragg told. But before we do, I think it's important to paint a picture of the Southern California landscape prior to his arrival. Doodle-doo, doodle-doo, doodle-doo. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis was responsible for 1 in 7 deaths. Treatment options were limited, but the most effective remedy was sunshine and fresh air, which California has in abundance. The California government started advertising their state as the land of sunshine and good weather and a place to rid yourself of tuberculosis. If you look at the first tourist guide for California published in 1873, the title of Chapter 8 is Southern California for Invalids. To accommodate the influx of sick people seeking fresh air and sunshine, many facilities were built on the outskirts of LA. These facilities were called sanatoriums, and tourism boards hyped them up. Many of the treatment centers commissioned artists to create beautiful looking images that would adorn postcards, I guess for patients to send to other sunshine seekers. Hey, look, we got the TB, but it's a good time over here. We're playing tennis and stuff. Sanatoriums served TB patients for many decades up until the 1940s, when the advent of modern-day antibiotics helped find a cure. But prior to all of this, the marketing strategy was really effective, and eventually the city was reaching a critical mass. During the height of the sanatorium boom, the railroad system was making intercontinental travel more accessible. People started piling to trains and heading west. This led to a whole host of problems that local government agencies had to work through. This part of Californian history is often referred to as California's Forgotten Plague, and it's actually super interesting, and I talk about it more in depth on my Patreon. And before you start tapping your fingers to skip this part, I'm not trying to sell you anything. Yes, you can become a member and support independent media if you want, but there is a free video podcast on Patreon. All you have to do is become a free member. The premise of the show is that I take all of the research from these videos and the stuff that I have to edit out, and I present it to my friend Jordan, who has no idea what I'm going to talk to him about, and we just sit down and I go through everything I've learned and I talk to him, and he's a funny dude. It's a good time, and we just go deeper into the subjects, and like I said, it's free. The link is in the description of this video. So at this point in history, California was starting to establish itself as this place where desperate sick people with an uncurable disease were going to maybe be provided with some relief. This created a perfect environment for a wellness grifter and con man to launch one of the most iconic wellness brands in American history, Bragg Live Food Products Company & Co.
Bragg. It's not weird if it works.
Now I'm going to spend the rest of the video telling you the true life story of Paul Bragg, at least to the best of my abilities after researching, and oh boy, there's a lot of lying. An assault charge, some accusations, and you might even be a little grossed out every time you see this happy duo sitting on the shelf at your local grocery store. Paul Bragg was really born in 1895, 14 years later than the birth date he repeated in his lectures and books. Honestly, is there a better marketing strategy for a longevity expert? This was a long time before the digital age, so you could pretty much just say whatever you wanted, and that's what he did. People had to be so impressed when they ask a 30-year-old something Paul, "So, how old are you?" To which he would reply, 45? Jesus, not even a wrinkle. He was also one of 3 children, not 16, but he did have at least one half sibling named Rufus from his mom's previous marriage. So maybe there are a few more siblings floating around, or maybe Paul did have 15 siblings, but many of them died in infancy or young because farm life is so incredibly rough in the late 19th century. The only problem with that theory is that he was not even born on a Virginia farm. He was born in the town of Batesville, Indiana, and his father wasn't a farmer who magically cured farm animals with apple cider vinegar. He was the editor, publisher, and printer of the Batesville Democratic Herald newspaper. So storytelling and attention-grabbing headlines are apparently in his genes. Yes, this means that Paul never saved a drowning man on the farm, he didn't get sent to military school, and the sister he cured, she didn't exist, and it is highly unlikely that he ever even had tuberculosis. The Heliotherapy Institute, where he claimed to be cured all while learning about medicine himself, that place didn't even open until 1903, and throughout his many books, he claimed that he was infected with tuberculosis at the age of 16, so if you go with the fake birth date of 1881, that would have him arriving in Switzerland in the year 1897, 6 years before the facility was even open. Or if you go with his actual birth date, which is verified with several government documents that have signatures that are identical to the signatures in all of his books, that would have him arriving at Dr. Rollier's Institute in 1911, 1 year before his second appearance in the Olympics. By all of his own accounts, Paul says that he fought the disease for years. So depending on what date you go with, there's a chance he wrestled in the Olympics while fighting for his life, all tuberculosis or whatever. It didn't happen. He didn't actually participate in the Olympics. He was in the Olympics 0 times. But since he wasn't in the Olympics, that means he had more time to open the nation's first health food store in 1912 then, right? About that, there are no documents that can substantiate the claim, although he would have had plenty of time to open a business when he was a teenager because he never completed more than 1 year of high school, and this fact is really interesting when you consider that he put MD, PhD, or whatever acronym sounded the most official at the time of publishing his books. I've rented a few digital copies of his books, and it seems like his life story and official title changes depending on whatever he's selling in that book. This makes sense to some degree. Like, for example, in a book about water, you would probably tell more stories about your relationship with dirty water growing up. But the backstory about life on the farm has conflicting narratives for a whole lot of reasons. One reason is he never lived on a farm anyway. But besides the fact that he never actually lived on a farm, the story about him living on a farm has conflicting narratives in just the few books that I read alone, which at this point, I'm sure you're not surprised. For example, in one book, he tells this story about the farm being essentially the fountain of youth, but in his book, The Shocking Truth About Water, Paul tells a story about his grandfather becoming gravely ill because of the farm's hard water. Clearly, he shifted his backstory to help support the theme and to help sell whatever he was talking about in the book he was writing. It also seems pretty clear that he didn't even open a health food store until over a decade later than the date that's still on all of the products and still on his website to this day. And the claim about being the first health food store in America, it's just not true. The first health food store in America was opened in 1869, in Oil City, Pennsylvania. But maybe Paul didn't know about that. So after Paul's non-participation in the Olympics, he did marry his first wife at the Chapel of St. Barnabas in New York in the year 1915. Shortly after the marriage, he moved back to Indianapolis to work as an agent for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. And then 2 years later, on April 6, 1917, America announced its involvement in the First World War, where Paul would... Look, I'm not even going to say it. You probably know at this point that that dude was not a war hero. In fact, on his draft card, he requested to not be sent overseas because he had 2 dependents. He had a young daughter and his wife. He did enlist in the National Guard, and from 1917 to 1921, he worked briefly at a YMCA as a director of physical education, and his last known position before moving to California was as the football coach for the 1920 season at Connorsville High School in Connorsville, Pennsylvania. Why did he move so much? I don't know. It's just a wild guess, but maybe he was a compulsive liar, and maybe people would catch on to him and he'd have to move. Or he'd get fired from some job for whatever crazy reason and he'd have to skip town and leave his reputation behind. But that's just a guess. So in 1921, he and his family headed to California, where he would spend the next few years hopping from job to job again. His resume from this time period was similar to his time on the East Coast. He worked at the LA YMCA, then in PE departments as a director or just a regular old gym coach. He and his wife had a son in 1922 named Robert, Lil Bobby Braggs, Robbie B, baby, who would eventually get done real dirty by his dad. Like, real, it's bad. But we'll talk about that in a second. In 1926, Paul becomes a wellness entrepreneur and opened the Health Center of Los Angeles on North 7th Street, and then 2 years later, he opened the Bragg Health Center on South Hill Street. To promote his business, he wrote a column in the LA Times. And I don't know if this was something he paid for or something that he got paid to do, but it was a thing. Paul's first marriage would dissolve, and he would later marry again briefly, but after his second marriage, he never remarried again. And none of this slowed him down because things were going so well with the health and wellness business that in 1929, Paul started giving free health lectures where he would charge people for private health consultations after his talks. Apparently, these consultations cost more than $300 when adjusted for inflation. And the only reason we know how much he charged was because the numbers are available in documents from a Maryland court case against him for practicing medicine without a license. These lectures covered a variety of topics ranging from virility, how to fix your vision without glasses, and how to eat better, and how to cure cancer naturally. What's for sure true and why his brand was successful and why his products are still around today is he was a charming dude. He definitely drew a crowd and he did inspire people, even if he was often pointing them in the wrong direction or selling them a bunch of lies. 1929 ended up being a very busy year for Paul. In addition to a crazy touring schedule for his lectures, he released his first book. But unfortunately, this made a dentist named St. Louis Albert Estes really upset. Dr. Estes sued Paul for copyright infringement, claiming that Bragg took large sections of his book, published in 1927, called Raw Food and Health, and he simply rearranged it and then mixed in personal anecdotes, and as we now know, most of those anecdotes weren't true anyway. Bragg would continue getting sued throughout the rest of his career, including an entire ban from the U.S. Postal Service in 1930 for fraud. You see, what had happened was he was selling a dietary supplement called Glantax, and after being examined, it was discovered to contain a mixture of bark, twigs, berries, and an abundance of over-the-counter laxatives, which is, I guess, a surefire way to get skinny. Then in 1934, he was sued for attacking an 18-year-old female organ player at a church during one of his lectures. Attacking young girls was apparently an ongoing theme for him. Then in 1935, he was arrested in Washington, D.C. for practicing healing arts without a license, but again, this was the age before computers, so he would just pack up and move on to the next town. And the more you dig through research, the more cases of fraud you'll find, but none of these allegations ever seemed to stop him. His company kept producing products and selling them to consumers, oftentimes under false premises. One of his more popular products was a salt replacement that was supposed to be free of any added salt. The package advertised a magical compound called sodium chloride, which is literally just a scientific name for table salt. The man, like I said, did have a talent for showmanship and was a natural leader, unfortunately. I first got interested in Bragg and his story when I was researching a man named Jack LaLanne, who hosted the first televised workout program. Jack was inspired as a teenager when attending one of Bragg's lectures. Jack turned his life around and worked with Bragg periodically. So at first I thought, hey, this Bragg guy, he just taught people about healthcare in like the 30s, and that's awesome. Then I saw a picture of him with a group of hikers. Some women were in swimsuits and the men were shirtless. nothing really wrong on the surface with this video, but something about it, the more I looked at it, was giving me cult vibes. So I dug in, and I wasn't wrong. And maybe Bragg and everything they do, maybe it's not a full-blown cult. And maybe he's not a full-blown cult leader, but he was for sure running some plays from the cult leader handbook. You find some people who are desperate, and they have difficult problems in their life, and then you offer them a simple solution, and you sell. Paul did this, and he did it really well, and he ultimately built a very successful business. And then after his untimely death in 1976, his daughter Patricia took over the brand. And he either died in Hawaii from a surfing accident at the ripe old age of 96, or he died from a heart attack in Miami, 81 years young. You decide whichever is true, but you know. But wait, this story's not over yet. I want to tell you about his daughter. She isn't really his daughter. Patricia married Paul's son, Robert, during the 50s. And then after only 3 years, they got divorced. Robert went on record accusing his wife of sleeping with and then running off with his father. Sometime after the divorce, Paul allegedly adopted Patricia, a full-grown woman, and there isn't any legal documentation of this anywhere, which is maybe a good thing if they were, actually, doing that. But they did spend the rest of their lives together and seemed happy, so I guess it worked out. All right, so that's it for this video, and what a legacy Mr. Paul Bragg has left. And like I said earlier in the video, there is a podcast video version of this story. It's free. It's on my Patreon. You can listen to it. You can watch it. Just click the link in the description below, and I'll see you again soon. Peace.